All right, we are rolling, gentlemen.
Have you started it?
Yeah.
All right. Women's activism and feminism. Our thesis statement. Women's activism and feminism during the antebellum period arose from Americans' women's desire to take on greater roles in social reforms, which resulted in more equal rights for women, a more united female identity, and a more respected public image. On to the causes. So the first one is the women's movement stemmed from other movements. So women were involved in lots of other movements, which have obviously been mentioned during the previous presentations during the antebellum period. And women realized that if they're fighting for all these other reforms, that they should be fighting for themselves as well. And then they were tired of being strictly Republican mothers. They wanted to take on greater roles in society, enter the workforce, and be more valuable to their families. Thirdly, they were influenced by the church. So women involved in the church ran charitable organizations, and in the church they were more valued and they had a greater voice, and they wanted to take their ideas outside of the church. And then they became more involved in public life. So during the antebellum period, women became more involved in the social life and community activities. And this made women realize the inequalities they faced, and they wanted to strive for change.
All right, I'm going to go into some of the significant figures in this in the women's movement. So first, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was born on November 12th, 1815, in Johnstown, New York. She was an abolitionist and leading figure of the early women's movement. She wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which was kind of a play off of the Declaration of Independence, and it basically just called for women's rights and women's freedom, and as well as women's voting rights. And Reed will go into that on the next slide. But she was also the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association for 20 years. She was heavily involved in abolition and temperance movements, and she organized a convention at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. This is where she read her Declaration of Sentiments, and this convention was also where all these women got together and first really started this feminism movement. And another fun fact is that she was a mother of 7 children and was often held back by her maternal duties, so she could not travel and give public lectures, but she composed many of the Susan B. Anthony speeches, and Susan B. Anthony is another important figure during this time, which we'll talk about later.
Okay, so the Declaration of Sentiments and Revolutions was given at the Seneca Falls Convention on July 19th, 1848 by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was the primary author, and she modeled it after the Declaration of Independence. So the first excerpt I'm going to read is, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." So obviously you can see the parallel between the Declaration of Independence and what Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, and she does this because she wants women to be equal to men in how they're viewed by society. And then below that are some of the propositions detailed also in the Declaration of Sentiments and Revolutions, and they read, "He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable rights to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws, in the formation of which she had no voice. He has withheld from her rights, which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners." So these propositions detail the women's perspectives and their viewpoint regarding how they're treated within society, and they're criticizing men, and they're talking about how men have all the power in the family and in the relationship, and they're calling for change.
Our next significant figure during this time is Susan B. Anthony. She was born on February 15th, 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. She was a pioneer crusader for women's suffrage movement in the U.S., and she was also the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association from 1892 to the 1900s. She paved the way for the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, and she worked really closely with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, often going on tours with her, speaking to great groups of people, and spreading the movement. She campaigned for the right to vote, abolition of slavery, the right for women to own property, and she also advocated for women's labor organizations. She gave hundreds of speeches and lectures across the U.S. on women's rights, and she was really an influential person during this time. Our next significant figure is Sojourner Truth. She was a prominent abolitionist and women's rights activist. She was born into slavery in Swarthmore, Ulster County, New York, in around 1797, and she gave herself this name to spread hope throughout the countryside, to give Black women and Black slaves hope that they could finally get the freedom. She recruited Black troops for the Union Army, and her most significant piece is that she wrote the speech on racial inequalities and feminism called Anti-Woman. She delivered this at the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851, and it was published a month later by Marius Robinson, an editor of the Ohio newspaper. And Truth continued to work closely with Robinson and sought political equality for all women while chastising the abolitionist community for failing to seek civil rights for Black women and men. So next we're going to go into our second primary document, Ain't I a Woman, mentioned earlier, which was written by Sojourner Truth. So that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I've plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. Ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most of all of them sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? So this is a really powerful speech that she gave at the Akron, Ohio convention. This really inspired a lot of Black women to stand up for themselves because they weren't seeing the same changes that white women were seeing during this time. So here she kind of just says that she can do everything that a man can do, but she's treated lesser. Such as when she says she works in barns and she can eat as much as a man, but she doesn't get the same respect that other men do. She also compares herself to other women during this time, saying that she also herself is a mother, and that many other mothers during this time were given respect by men, but not Black women. Our next significant figure is Dorothy Dix. She was born in Hampton, Maine in 1802 into a troubled childhood. Her father was gone most of the time, and her mother suffered from depression. She became an author, teacher, and reformer, and she worked frequently in asylums to help people who were mentally ill. She also worked in the Civil War as a nurse, and she really helped female nurses become a true prominent figure in American history.
All right, so some of the accomplishments from the movement are that men supported the movement, and men did this because they wanted their wives to be wealthy and daughters to have property rights. But this was significant because obviously men held the position of power within society. So when men supported the movement, it was revolutionary. And then the Married Women's Property Laws in 1848, this granted women control over real property that was brought into marriage. And property bought during marriage belonged solely to the woman, as well as inheritances given to the woman were also hers. So this basically said that property and money that women had, they were able to keep it, and it didn't belong to the men. A third accomplishment was that women were able to consider themselves equal to men and more American. This was just the identity that was formed. And next is growing respect for women and motherhood. This was also from society and especially men. And during this movement, women had more of a voice and they were able to make their influence felt. And lastly, greater opportunity in education in the workforce. Women, even though they didn't have the wages that men had and they didn't have the education opportunities, they still made strides in making progress in these areas.
So our legacy. First, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was one of the most influential first ladies during the time. She also really stood up for women's rights, and she was inspired by a lot of the feminism movements that happened earlier. Next is the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And this was really important because it was kind of like they could see the fruits of their labor, where they finally got to see everything pay off and they got what they wanted. Next is the annual Seneca Falls Convention, started in 1848. So we talked about this earlier, but even now, it's been happening every year, and they always celebrate it as a really influential time for women's rights. And next, more education opportunities have occurred for women, and more colleges came up that invited women to come study, and it really helped pave the way for women's education in the future.
All right, thank you. That is it.